Okay, so I'm going to turn this meeting over to Christine. This is our court meeting. We have quite a bit to get done. So just to review, concurrence means there's a statement that we can agree with or disagree with. On consensus questions, we need to get a sense of the members' feeling. All right, Christine. Christine has worked really hard with her committee. They have done a massively awesome job of accumulating information. And some of it you've seen before, but Christine, you're on.
Thanks to everybody for showing up on this Earth Day. And hopefully you got through some of the summary white paper that we put together. I can't say enough about the team that we have for this. They're awesome. And it's been a good project. And to start this off, the next slide, please. We are dedicating our effort here to the memory of an amazing person that I had the opportunity to get to know, but not as well as the rest of the people that are in this group today. Jody McCaffrey was just a spark for all of us to engage in public participation. And again, we might have an announcement today about a scholarship that's been put in place at SWAC, which is where she did a lot of her educational training. And so you can make an announcement maybe afterwards about how that's rolling out. And so we're really glad to honor Jody. Just to give you an idea of the progress that we made, we started actually in 2021 on this, and we had our first meeting in 2022, a virtual meeting where we rolled out our study and where we were on it. Then we had, that was January 22, January 23, we did the same thing, again, doing virtual meetings so that we could record what we did and post it for everyone to see. And today we are doing this final study report with using an in-person opportunity with the help of Paul here and his multiple cameras and the technology to where we can do real-time recording of our discussions as well. So we have the draft white paper and the study questions, and we have hard copies of those study questions if you need those. And as Alice said, we're going to be having a discussion about point by point of those particular items in the criteria. So next slide, please. I don't want to go into the policy in depth about the port, but the port is a public entity and it's paid for by you folks. And this slide just puts together some of the basic fiscal understanding of where the port sits in terms of $5 billion real market value, assessed value at $3.459 billion. And you're all paying it for part of that on your taxes every year to the county. Then another point about, we have really been trying hard to get all of these reports that are required as part of the requirements of legislature that empowers the ports, and we still don't seem to be able to find those, so we can discuss that later. We are going to refer to these principles quite a bit during our study evaluation. These are principles that are in their strategic plan, and they're pretty lofty, and you've seen those in the report. Investing in infrastructure for the rail, strengthening multimodal transportation systems, so forth, expanding the commercial fishing and recreation collaborations, and promoting responsible environmental stewardship. And so all of those principles are really important in our evaluation. The port also has a strategic business plan that takes a few of those items and expands on specific, mainly sort of capital improvements, capital development. And those principles don't look quite the same as the previous ones, but this is what their business plan has been focused on. And we will be evaluating a lot of our report within that framework as well. Next slide, please. So the capital plan for improvement has two components of it, and those have to do with the railroad. We will cover some highlights of our studies of the railroad. The other capital improvements in that strategic plan include the Charleston improvements in the dock and so forth, bulk commodities, and we put a note there that bulk commodities were part of the 2015 strategic plan, and instead of the intermodal or multimodal that seems to have been more of an emphasis recently. And finally, channel deepening. So those have been part and parcel of their capital improvement plan for some time. Okay, next slide. So we're going to go through a review, and we've organized this into different bulleted areas here that are shown, and we're going to start with the first one, which is the expansion of the Fed navigation channel, and I'm going to have Michael take our discussion from there.
Thanks, Christine. When Christine recruited Jan and me to the committee already had made a substantial level of progress, but one of the contributions that was possible for Jan and I to make is to say, well, okay, if the evaluation period since the last time the league did an evaluation of the port was in 2000, we did some historical research to say what kind of activities has the port been engaged in for the period from 2000 to 2023. Because some of those projects lasted or had time periods of several years, we had to actually move back into that prior evaluation period to pick up some of the projects that were in process at the turn of the century in 2000. So we've created a summary here, and one of the major efforts that has been at the forefront of the port's effort is to expand the deep draft navigation channel in Coos Bay. The port has been advocating expansion of the navigation channel since April of 1921. So it's the 122nd anniversary. We found a great letter that the Port of Coos Bay commissioners submitted to the U.S. Congress requesting funds to deepen the navigation channel. At the time, it was 17 feet, and they wanted to go deeper. Our current channel is at 37 feet deep and 350 feet wide. But in 2007, the port went to the legislature and requested funding to and received authorization for $60 million of lottery bond funding, and that was to accomplish the Federal Navigation Channel. And as we chased this project down, it brought us decades later into a proposal that was supposed to last 2 or 3 years. In 2008, a shipping company named Maersk was actually engaged with the port, and there was a proposal to do a major container shipping terminal in Jordan Cove, right next to where the liquefied natural gas terminal that had just emerged, into the discussion of that had just emerged. But at Maersk's recommendation, we've inferred, the proposal was to deepen the navigation channel to 51 feet deep and 500 feet wide. Now, there was funding expended to evaluate that because the Corps of Engineers has to a federal agency has to approve that navigation channel expansion. But in 2008 was the downturn of the economy, right? We had the Great Recession, and Maersk withdrew from further discussion and engagement with the port, and the funding that was being directed to the Corps of Engineers study also dried up. And so that proposal that the Corps of Engineers had formally announced with a Federal Register notification was just terminated. The next time that it reemerged was around 2015, and that's when Jordan Cove project was really getting some traction. And for reasons that I have not been able to identify, the proposal to expand the channel went from 51 feet deep and 500 feet wide to 45 feet deep and 400 feet wide. So it shrunk. And I suspect that's because the costs, they had already determined that the costs to go to 51 feet were exorbitant, and it might have been infeasible for economic reasons or for logistical, technical reasons. But anyway, during the course of the Jordan Cove LNG proposal, there were major funding contributed by the Jordan Cove Energy Company to the port, and the port then in turn paid consultants to provide the information that the Corps of Engineers needed to conduct their environmental assessment. Because the Corps of Engineers, this is a proposal to expand a federally authorized navigation channel, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to oversee that because they have legal responsibility to maintain the federally authorized channel that Congress approves. So there were tens of millions of dollars expended that were largely pass-through money from Jordan Cove to the Port of Coos Bay, then subsequently to consultants who provided the information to the Corps, which is how these processes work. And at that point, then, when the Jordan Cove proposal was terminated, the port was almost ready to complete the Corps of Engineers study. They had furnished almost everything that the Corps of Engineers had requested. But one of the key ingredients of any proposal or evaluation by the Corps of Engineers is there has to be two beneficiaries identified. At least two beneficiaries must be identified for the Corps of Engineers to study a project. And it was those two beneficiaries that had been named were the Jordan Cove Energy Project and the Roseburg Ship Terminal. When Jordan Cove disappeared, there was only one beneficiary. So very quickly then, that was about the time that this container terminal proposal happened. And that then became the second beneficiary. The port approached the Corps and said, hey, we'd like to just finish up the study. We still need a deeper channel, but we'd just like to substitute a container shipping terminal for a liquefied natural gas terminal. Still bigger ships, still need a bigger channel. Well, the pandemic came, the project was on pause because there wasn't the same revenue stream that Jordan Cove had been providing. The project has been on pause for about 3 years, and just within the last several weeks, my communication with the Corps of Engineers has identified that the Corps of Engineers has said it's been too long since we've issued our 2017 National Environmental Policy Act scoping notice, and today the economic nature of the activity has changed, the types of vessels have changed. We're going to terminate our evaluation of your request. So as it stands right now, the Corps of Engineers doesn't have any proposal from the Port of Coos Bay to study a navigation channel. Yes, so next slide, please. All right, so again, we've broken up these developments that sort of by geography. There's a whole bunch of activity that the Port of Coos Bay has been engaged in over the last 20-some years that's focused on the development of the North Spit, industrial properties on the North Spit. These are properties that received industrial zoning designation with the establishment of the Estuary Management Plan in the 1980s. But also subsequent, again, we will highlight a few salient features that don't directly relate to the port activities, but these are also important discoveries and activities that have taken place in the same time frame. And one of those activities was the issuance of these tsunami inundation maps that the U.S. or the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries issued in 2012. And so the industrial zoning was established in the late 1980s with the adoption of the Estuary Management Plan. But we have subsequently discovered that that entire place that was zoned for industrial activities in a very high risk tsunami inundation zone. Next slide. One of the significant engagement points that the league has taken in the last 20 years has been engagement in the evaluation of the Jordan Cove LNG, initially LNG import facility, and then subsequently an LNG export facility over the course of about 17 years. And the formal position of the league has been to oppose that project. And ultimately in 2021, there was a formal withdrawal of the proposal and a vacation of the requests by the Jordan Cove Energy Project. Next slide. Weeks following the withdrawal of the Jordan Cove Energy Project, additional artist renderings of port projects began to emerge. And I will say that our study team had a very challenging time finding these documents, and it was not with any level of cooperation from the Port of Coos Bay. The Port of Coos Bay was a reluctant participant in this study, and we'll leave it at that. But the proposal now is across from Empire at the Hollering Place, if we know where the Hollering Place in Empire, on a location on the North Spit, the former location of the anadromous fish salmon ranch that was there. That's a zoned industrial land. The port has demolished the old fish hatchery facilities there, and they have been marketing this now as this potential bulk commodities terminal, which was referenced earlier, but then very quickly following that, this container facility. The idea is that there would be a very large, brand new, West Coast wide container shipping terminal that would be an import-export facility. Here it says 1 million 40-foot shipping containers, but the world measures the volume of containers by these things called TEUs, which are 20-foot equivalent units. So 1 million 40-foot shipping containers is actually 2 million TEUs, 20-foot equivalents. Okay, so that's 3 berths. The vessels that they're proposing to use this carry between 8,600 containers, 20-foot containers, and 12,000 containers. In order to achieve a 2 million TEU volume, you would need to have 3 ships calling at the terminal a week, arrivals and departures. So that would be 3 arrivals, 3 departures, so a total of 6 passages of the channel. It would also require these things to be shipped out on trains, and you can see the train yard in this graphic illustration, and that's shown in red on these slides. And they would use the existing rail line to move north and connect to the Class 1 rail system in Eugene. Key elements of this: you need a deeper, wider channel. That's a familiar phrase. We need to build a new ship berth. You can see this conceptual drawing showing the concrete terminal wharf projecting out over the existing portion of the estuary, and then lining up next to the blue dashed line, which is the Federal Navigation Channel. So it would be immediately adjacent to that section of the Federal Navigation Channel. And of course, our existing railroad doesn't have the capacity to handle the volume of containers, so large-scale investments would be necessary in that. Next slide, please. So the port, you may have heard in the news that the port has submitted a grant to the U.S. Department of Transportation. They did that last year for $1.2 billion. That's 1,000 million. And the channel modifications would be roughly half of that amount, $460 million. And the rail portion of that would be $780,000. I think it's notable that a portion of that dredging work for the channel modifications has nearly $60 million for dredging rock, which means there is bedrock at the bottom of the channel. So I think that may be why we went from 51 feet to 45 feet, because it's very expensive to dredge bedrock. I jokingly of late have been saying the port has hit bottom. The application that was submitted to the U.S. Department of Transportation was rejected. There were letters submitted that call the financial and technical viability of this into question. And the project was deemed to be not supported by this mega grant proposal because it wasn't cost effective and because the applicant didn't appear to have the technical skills to actually execute the work. So the port immediately upon notice of rejection stated its intent to reapply, and they are in the process of reapplying just now, possibly even later this month. In April, May, I would think is the next round of submission. Next slide, please. Again, weeks following the disappearance of the Jordan Cove proposal, in early 22, this report was published, one of two reports to examine the feasibility of developing the Port of Coos Bay as a support facility for offshore floating wind. And that had been rattling around in discussions at the port for some years prior, but there were two well-financed studies conducted. And you may note that here in this proposal, up in the upper right corner is the Roseburg Ship Terminal. So this is the very location of the proposed Jordan Cove LNG terminal. And I can tell you it was weeks, months following the disappearance of Jordan Cove that this proposal was substituted. And this study, commissioned by an wind energy development company, partnered with the port and identified that the port with significant modifications could be suitable for some of the activities associated with offshore wind. Again, here's a proposal to expand the navigation channel to the tune, in this case, to the tune of $475 million, as opposed to the previous cost estimates. Next slide, please. All right, I think we start to transition here, and I think it's Steve's turn now, right?
Yep.
All right, so Steve did a look at the rail line, and he can give you updates on what would be involved in upgrading the rail system.
This is a slide of the map of the rail line route, Coos Bay to Eugene. You can see it's a pretty curvy, wandering route, and that's because of the terrain, the roughness of the terrain, and you get inland through the coast range. The railroad is a single track, and it has several sidings that allow passage of oncoming and outgoing trains. There are 9 tunnels, 121 bridges, and at least 240 vehicle crossings at grade, and only 14 of those are signalized. The rail line was built by Southern Pacific between 1911 and 1916. The Oregon History Project on Railroading and Highways said of our railroad, in its early years, the rail line to Coos Bay had a nickname. It was punk, rotten, and nasty because of the steep grades, hairpin curves, and breathtaking trusses, which are still in place today, as well as smoke from the coal-fired firebox, which isn't present today. But those other 3 factors are still present in the rail line the way it works today. So it's a challenge, and it's a long run, and they're running about 10 to 15 miles an hour currently. and hope to get up to 25 and maybe even 45, but I don't know how that would be possible personally, with all the curves and such. There are 9 tunnels in the route, and they range from 477 feet long to 4,177 feet, which is a pretty long tunnel. Several tunnel collapses have occurred over the years. One in December of 2006 required nearly 2 months to clear and repair that damage and to restore service to the rail line. The tunnels would need major renovation of the portals as the entryways, both coming and going. They need to be able to crown out the tunnel roofs to accept double stack container carriers. They have to run at about 19 to 19 and a half feet, and usually they allow about another foot of clearance. So there's a lot of alteration that would be required with all of those tunnels. These are some of the upgrades that have been done on the rail line so far. The rail line was purchased in 2007, or no, 2009. But in 2007, the Central Oregon and Pacific Rail Line, which operated the rail line and owned it, they operated for the port. But they abandoned, well, they first embargoed or shut it down, and then they said they had to abandon it because it was unsafe, mainly referring to the tunnels, and that 2007 or 2006 tunnel collapse had occurred just before 2007 when they were wanting to abandon it. It was also not very profitable, I think, too. They were not operating a lot of rail cars out of Coos Bay. In 2009, the port purchased the rail line for $16.6 million after a lengthy court battles, legal fees, which amounted to $1.5 million. In 2012, Stantec, an engineering and consultancy, was hired to develop a management program for maintaining the bridges on the line to Eugene. The port has spent about $100 million on various repairs over the past 10 years, including the Coos Bay Swing Span Bridge. And that swing span bridge was just repaired twice, in last October and then in, I believe, December. And the costs for those emergency repairs, which shut that portion of the rail line down, came to $1 million for those 2 repairs. On the crossings for the rail line, there are 240 of those crossings, too. I neglected to mention. They include driveways, private driveways that would go to a house or maybe a couple of houses, access to businesses, farmland, timberland, and forests. The trains at all of those crossings have to sound their horn before entering that crossing. And these trains would, if they were operating container service, running 6 trains to Eugene and then 6 trains back daily, they would be running into the night, certainly. And the train requirements for sounding horns continues during those periods as well. At Eugene, there may be an issue regarding the quiet zone that Eugene has been trying to put in place for about the last 7 or 8 years. I believe it was in 2015, they were authorized by the federal government to create a quiet zone because Eugene had 24 trains coming into the downtown every day at that time, and it was quite a noise issue because they'd sounded every crossing. And so Eugene was able to get authorization, but they didn't have the funding for several years. And then when they finally got funding, it went into lengthy negotiation with Union Pacific, and Union Pacific has been unable to come to terms with the city on that quiet zone. So it's still hanging up, and trains are apparently still having to sound off as they did before. The rail line was also affected by the closure of the American Bridge operation up in Reedsport, which built lots of fabricated steel structures for bridges and other purposes. And also the Georgia Pacific Mill closure here in 2019 that reduced rail traffic as well. And the improvements so far done to date, as the slide says, only brings the train to 10 to 50 mile per hour performance.
I mentioned earlier that the proposals that are going on by our port haven't taken place in a vacuum. The world around us continues to evolve, and there's been some significant developments that have taken place concurrently with the proposals that the Port of Coos Bay has been pursuing. And the proponents of this new largest area of focus for the port has been to advance this container import-export facility. And if you're handling containerized freight, an ideal container port imports shiploads of full containers and then turns around, receives export containers that are also full and exports those. So an ideal port has a perfect balance of import commodities as well as export commodities. And when posed with the question of what export commodities would Coos Bay use as containerized freight, the port has said, well, we would provide agricultural products from Southern Oregon as containerized products. But we note now that in the area of Millersburg, just north of Albany, in December of last year, the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Build Oregon funding program that the port has also derived funding from opened up a new logistics, a rail logistics facility on the footprint of the old Willamette Industries pulp mill there north of Albany, right sitting next to I-5. Well, that was a $35 million investment. And its express purpose was to receive and deliver 81% of the containerized agricultural products of Oregon and load them to the Class 1 rail there in Albany, Union Pacific and Burlington Northern rail systems, and expedite them to the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. So the ports of Seattle and Tacoma collaborated on this project to say, we have expanded facilities to handle refrigerated agricultural cargoes. They have 1,500 plug-ins for these refrigerated containers. So what started to be a challenging mass balance of imports and exports for the proposal in Coos Bay became even more challenging if with a $35 million investment, it was possible to intercept or support 80% of the agricultural commodities that are being produced in the state. And I will point that the state of Oregon, we have Governor Kate Brown at the ribbon cutting ceremony, the state of Oregon provided 25 of the $35 million to develop this project. Take it, Jan.
So you talk about what's going on the North Spit. The port also has other assets, and they have a fair number of assets in the Upper Bay. There on the right-hand side, that's all port-owned land in the Upper Bay. They have a few docks, but you'll also notice that most of their land is actually in the bay. They are those round dredge spoil islands with the little dots on them, and that big area of orange there that is essentially unmodified tide flats. You know, the tide comes in and out over it, but the port has ownership of these areas. They also have ownership of the areas over on the east side property near the new schools, where they used to put, many decades ago, where they used to put all the dredge spoils. So any of you who walked up Milcoma Marsh have seen those dredge spoil areas. Well, the school owns some of it, but a lot of that area that you're walking on is actually port land, as is the area to the west of that, which is that unvegetated area where they set off the fireworks on the 4th of July. So they have significant ownership areas up here, and they don't ever address them. There's no plan for them. They have no asset management plan for them. And that this is quite an opportunity that the port could take to manage these lands and think about how to use these areas, particularly in terms of sort of conservation management. And we'll talk about that later when we go to the consensus questions. Next one. One thing that they have talked about developing in the Upper Bay in recent times is when Georgia Pacific pulled out, the port bought the mill. A company actually came in, cleaned up the mill site, and then the port bought it for them, and they're calling it Terminal 1. And the total cost of the project for Terminal 1 is $14.5 million. This is where they got the money for it. The state paid some, and then the Federal Department of Transportation has given them just over $4.5 million to actually fund some kind of construction. So the idea here is to make this into a multimodal terminal, a bulk handling. There's no evidence yet of any company coming into being interested in using this, but of course it's very difficult to get that kind of information from the port because they always go into executive session to discuss those sort of things. So we don't have any information about what this is going to be used for, or whether the port is actually got any company or business that is interested in using this. Next one, please. What we do know, though, is in the purchase agreement, there is a non-compete agreement, so it can't be used for anything to do with timber products. So a company that does things with wood cannot use this area. So it has to be something other than wood products that goes off from this terminal. And those are those facilities improvements they're talking about making with that $4.5 million that they got from the US government. Next one. And then another development in the Upper Bay is in 2021, they purchased the hub building. They moved their operations from where they were previously on the Front Street area to the hub building. And they got a loan to do that. And they have some offices that they are trying to lease out to other entities in downtown Coos Bay. So there's the details for the purchase price and how much they eventually will pay once the 20-year loan is over. So we're talking about $3.5 million for the hub building. Next slide, please. So the third place that the port has assets is in the Charleston Marina Complex. And they've had this for a long time. And again, those orange areas are land in Charleston that they own. And they have a fair number of assets here that they manage. They have a shipyard. They have an RV park. They have storage units that they rent out. And they have a marina complex. So one of the port's roles is to support the fishing community, the fishing industry in Charleston. And because they own the marina, they don't necessarily own all the buildings on the marina. So some of the fish plants are individually owned and run. They've done quite a bit in this sort of marina complex. One of the things they did was the state purchased a small dredge that the port runs because these small ports like Gold Beach and they don't have federal navigation channels and they can't use the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to dredge their channels, but they have to get their boats out. And so the port actually runs a small dredge to help those ports and uses it to dredge like the Charleston Marina where the slips are, because that's not in the federal navigation channel. So that's something the port has done. They do have a master plan for this area. It was developed in 2013, The port is required every 10 years to do master planning. So they'll be coming up to do master planning. The state requires them to do it in this year. They need to get all to do some master planning, not just for Charleston, but the whole port complex. And they do have an advisory committee. The advisory committee meets quarterly, and they actually do minutes. You can read what the advisory committee has said. So that was one of the things I spent quite a bit of time reading the exciting minutes of the Charleston Advisory Committee. But it does tell you a lot about what's going on in the port, which is something that's often difficult to get from other parts of their assets. And one of the things I learned from reading these minutes is there is considerable deferred maintenance, estimated about $11 million worth of deferred maintenance in this area. And they are working with helping the fishing processing plants to upgrade their wastewater management as well. There's a serious issue with the wastewater that goes out from the fishing plant, and DQ is coming down on them, and there's going to need to be a lot of work. And the port is working with that very slow. One of the assets that occurs in this area is the ice dock, and I think some of you will remember that the ice dock burnt, and the port built a new ice dock, which is a fantastic ice dock. The fishermen have an issue with it because they didn't build a long enough dock to park the boat to fill up the ice with. And there's a lot of concerns in the port meeting minutes about this fishing boat access to the ice dock. So it's something the port has been talking about, but doesn't appear to have done anything about. Next slide. Yeah, and the final thing we're going to talk about is the Charleston shipyard. And this is a real economic sort of driver for Charleston. In fact, I'm from the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology, and we just launched a $1 million boat that was built in the Charleston shipyard last week, doing trials in the bay, and one of the shipyard builders built it. So, and they've built lots of other boats. The oyster barges you see going up and down in Upper Coos Bay, they've built them here. This is a real economic driver for Charleston. And they've done some good things here. They've upgraded the water quality. There's a whole piece of information about that in the study. They have a real issue, of course, because the fishing community, and especially the salmon fishing community, is not doing very well. And so there's a lot of abandoned boats. And the port has a plan to get rid of those abandoned boats and has done some of that. But there's a lot of unmet needs. That $11 million of unmet needs, and a lot of it is here in the Charleston shipyard. And from the port meeting minutes, I was able to see that the fishermen, they're just incensed that the marine ways, that's where they pull their boats out to get them fixed or repainted, is just crumbling. The travel lift that they have is not working well, and it can't pick. The travel lift is what they get the boats out of the water with, so that they can paint the bottoms and do repairs and things. And it's not big enough for all the Charleston fishing boats. It needs maintenance. This is a major issue in the port meeting minutes at the moment. So that's some of the issues with the Charleston shipyard. And at that point, I'm going to hand it back to Christine, because we're going to start on the discussion in the narrative.
So before we go into the study questions evaluation, we want to just take a quick break here for anybody that has a specific question regarding what we just, the overview, and then we'll move into looking at our assessment. So are there any specific questions that people want to get addressed right now?